set Greece on the path that followed. Later, it turned out that it wasn't enough, so the U.S. supported openly the first direct revival of fascism in Europe, not hidden. The fascist generals were supported by the United States when they took over in the 60s, and that lasted until 1974, I think, when there was an uprising which threw them out. Well, okay, that's Greece. Italy. Italy has been the target of more CIA action than anywhere else in the world, as far as the record shows, up until at least the 1970s. At that point, the record runs dry. In Italy, there was a very powerful left. And if there had been free elections, the left would have won. And the U.S. was very much frightened of that. And in fact, go back a little bit. Italy was the first place where U.S. and British troops landed on the continent. 1943, they landed in Sicily, then started moving up the peninsula, and they had a problem. The Nazis had pretty much were being driven from Italy, as in Greece, by the resistance, by the popular resistance. So as the U.S. and British forces came in, they had to crush the resistance and reinstate the fascists, which is exactly what they did. So Field Marshal Badoglio, great fascist hero, conqueror of Abyssinia, he was installed as prime minister, and the king, the pro-fascist king, was brought back, especially as the troops went to the north. The north had already been liberated by the resistance. Nazis pretty much driven out. They'd established a functioning society with worker-owned factories, driving out managers and so on. The United States was horrified. And the British, and remember it was the Labour Party then, they were even more horrified. The idea of driving managers out of factories and running it yourself, I mean, utter anathema. So the liberated society of northern Italy had to be crushed, and the traditional forces reinstituted, including, of course, leading fascists. And in fact, this was done all through Europe, but the most important places were Italy and Greece, because it had advanced farther then. Now, Italy and Greece were both understood to be part of the system of controlling Middle East oil. The transit lines went through the Mediterranean, so that's all one big system, of which this is one component, and the U.S. was not going to sacrifice that. The control of Middle East oil was regarded as an absolutely central part of post-war global planning, and of course control over Europe. There were other aspects too. The formation of NATO, for example, was theoretically motivated by concern that Russia will invade. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but it was also driven by the concern that Europe might move in an independent path. I mean, Europe's a big place. It's got an economy the scale of the United States, more advanced than the United States in many respects. It had been crushed by the war, but it was going to reindustrialize, and it did over the next couple of decades, and became a flourishing economy. Well, there's always a concern that it might strike out on its own. It might become what was called a third force, independent of the United States and Russia. It may be along Gaullist lines. De Gaulle had this plan of a Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals as a separate force in world affairs. That's anathema to U.S. planners.
The embrace of fascist leaders by the West is often explained as a product of Cold War necessity, yet the reality is more complex. From the very beginning of the fascist movement, many Western business leaders not only praised fascists, but offered significant financial, intellectual, and moral support. The case of Spain provides one of the most striking examples. When peasants and workers took control of production, consumption, and social life across much of the country, world leaders united in opposition against them. Their system of self-government threatened not only the fascists and Stalinists, but liberal democracies in America and the rest of the world. The rebels called themselves anarchists.
In the media and general commentary, the term anarchy is used to indicate chaos, bomb throwing, disruption, criminality. The actual meaning of the term is quite different. It involves mutual aid, cooperation, as close as you can get to pure democracy, real popular control over all institutions, sometimes resistance, usually leaderless resistance. That's partly ignorance and partly a way to undermine efforts to try to achieve a cooperative society with popular control, which of course is obviously very much opposed by elite interests.
En ese caso, cuando se trata de la toma del montón, pues naturalmente se tiene que tener aquella capacidad y aquella manera de pensar, de que por qué razón vas a coger tú hoy 2 kilos de carne si con uno tienes bastante y mañana puedes ir a buscar otro fresco. O un par de zapatos.
Allí se estaba exento de luz, de agua, de escuela, de todo. Allí no había que pagar nada.
Y no había egoísmo de nada. Nada, ni el egoísmo no existía. ¿Cómo puede existir si no hay dinero? Cuando no hay dinero no puede haber egoísmo.
Hoy lo dices y no lo comprende la gente, pero que no, que se asumió bien.
El haber hecho la colectividad, cómo crear la colectividad. La inmensa mayoría del pueblo lo encontró muy bien, y estos que no eran sindicalistas ni eran anarquistas.
Había una pizarra del sindicato grandiosa, y cualquier trabajador, una queja que tuviera, la apuntaba en la pizarra, y en la asamblea se discutía aquello.
El exponer una cosa era ponerlo, digamos, en armonía de los demás si aceptaban aquella proposición. Si se acordaba bien, si no se acordaba, pues otra cosa, ¿verdad? Pero siempre desde la base. No nos regiamos porque no mandase el comité regional una cosa. Porque claro, cada pueblo tiene su cultura. Por lo tanto, al tener su cultura, tiene sus costumbres. Pues no son las mismas costumbres nuestras aquí valencianas, como diríamos las andaluces.
Compleja. Tienes que ser consciente de que trabajas para ti, entonces que ya no mantienes a ningún patrón, aún trabajas con más...
Esa forma de operar, esa forma de conducirse éticamente en la sociedad sin necesidad de que viniese el gendarme de turno.
O sea, la autogestión, yo creo que es la asignatura.
How do the liberal democracies respond? Well, exactly as you'd expect them to. They despise democracy for very good reasons. The masters do not want the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders to run their own affairs because they'll do it at their own interest. And you lose hierarchy and domination and centralized control and all the values that the masters naturally want. So the liberal democracies essentially joined forces with the fascists and the communists to destroy the revolution. After they destroyed the anarchist social revolution, then they started fighting among themselves. But the first task for the first year was to make sure that the popular revolution was crushed. And of course the communists were in fact in the lead. And the fascists, of course, had their own interests. The United States was a little bit marginal at that time. It wasn't the major world power. It was mostly England and France. But Roosevelt also played a role. So there was an embargo passed, which prevented arms from going to the Republic. However, Roosevelt tolerated breaking of the embargo illegally to provide oil to the fascists. The State Department pretended it didn't know. Of course they did know. I remember this as a child. The left-wing press was reporting it. The government said they never heard about it. And of course the media went along with the government. Years later, the documents came out and they conceded it had been happening all along. So yes, Roosevelt was basically supporting the fascists, but primarily destroying the anarchist revolution, which was a real threat.
Un Estado totalitario armonizará en España el funcionamiento de todas las capacidades y energías del país en el que dentro de la unidad nacional el trabajo, estimado como el más ineludible de los deberes, será el único exponente de la voluntad popular. Y merced a él podrá manifestarse el auténtico sentir del pueblo español a través de aquellos órganos naturales que, como la familia, el municipio, la asociación y la corporación, harán cristalizar en realidades nuestro ideal supremo.
Fascism is a very rational system. It is an instrument by the ruling plutocracy to distract the people with the accoutrements of a false revolution. There's always a false populism, and there's a lot of goose-stepping, and there's a lot of manipulation of symbols and sentiments and love of the state and the like. Much of politics is the rational use of irrational symbols. So fascism, the attention that when people study Italian fascism or Nazism especially, they focus on it as a kind of insane movement that just happened, carried on by this maniac Adolf Hitler, and the Germans were just went out of their heads and were led astray. In fact, what they tried to do is direct the real grievances of the German people toward irrelevant enemies.
Die Parteien versprachen den Himmel auf Erden.
And when the fascists came into power, they cut wages by 50%. They destroyed every labor union. They destroyed every opposition party and every newspaper, closed them down. They abolished all inheritance taxes for the rich or cut them drastically. They abolished all cartel taxes for the corporations. Pretty much what's being done here without having to go politically all that far. So fascism is an instrument whereby the plutocracy can control and hopefully affect a final solution to the class struggle. You totally shatter and destroy and enslave the working class, and people just have to take it. What substantiates what I just said, that fascism is an instrument of the plutocracy, is the way the plutocracy acted toward the fascists. Not just the German plutocracy, which gave Hitler enormous sums of money, which enabled him to go all over the country, but also the plutocracy of the United States, where all sorts of eminent members of that plutocracy openly supported the fascists.
IG Farben Industrie, Allgemeine Elektrizität Gesellschaft, Siemens Zuckerwerke, Siemens Halske, Opel, Fried Group Antigesellschaft, Tokyo Shibaura, Mitsubishi Electrical Engineering Company, Westinghouse Electric Company of Japan, Compagnia Generale di Elettricità, Magrini Società Anonima, and many more all over the world.
Among the titans of Wall Street, there was a tremendous amount of sympathy for Adolf Hitler and for Mussolini, coupled with a great deal of fear about what they perceived as a rising red threat and the threat from unions. So they were largely sympathetic with what they saw going on over there. And of course, these people and the attorneys working for them, like the Dulles brothers, who would later go on to run the State Department and the CIA, were very much in tune on this sort of thing. Put them in an awkward position, of course, later on when they ended up having to fight against Hitler. But that never really, I think, changed their fundamental belief, which was that they shared common cause with industrialists everywhere. In fact, many of these people were involved with companies that had operations in Germany and in occupied territories of Germany. We later saw the prosecution of a number of them